A century ago, Britain ruled over a quarter of the planet. In this series, I will go in search of Britain's imperial past.
I have found gold.
And uncover its legacies. How did a small island on the edge of Europe end up dominating the world?
He turned a miserable group of accountants into swashbuckling pirates.
From its proudest achievements to its most shameful failures.
We're ripped away from Mother Africa into a strange land.
And how has the history of empire transformed Britain?
We became the black people of Britain.
On this journey, I uncover the extraordinary story of the biggest empire that the world has ever seen. In this program, I'm exploring the jewel in the crown of empire. The way that Britain established its rule here would provide a model for the globalization of today. In India, Britain's imperial power was founded upon one of the world's first great multinational companies. Unlike today's corporate giants, it exercised political power directly with guns.
This company went in for a type of exploitation that the world has not seen.
They had a divine right to rule. It was as simple as that.
Opportunities to trade and corporate greed led Britain into entanglements all over the world. But in India, those base motives were gradually converted into the pomp, grandeur, and glory of the British Raj. India has long gripped the British imagination. A vast and exotic subcontinent, home to ancient civilizations, powerful rulers, and untold riches. Here, Britain honed its imperial skills, and possessing India attracted the grudging admiration of rivals and added to British power. This is the Queen Victoria Memorial Hall, dedicated to the Empress of India. The Raj was at its pinnacle during her reign. It was, in a way, the perfection of the colonial idea, a moment when Britain was totally committed to the governance of the Queen's 300 million subjects here, and when India seemed indispensable to Britain's prestige. At the time of Queen Victoria's death in 1901, Britain ruled over a quarter of the planet and 400 million people. No other possession competed with the glamour of India, with its capital at Calcutta. British authority did not originate with the state or military conquest. The father of empire in India, the man responsible for securing British power, was a businessman. He was bold, opportunistic, and visionary. Some would say a greedy villain. The back wall of these houses must be the outer wall of the Clive house. Clues about how Robert Clive led a profit-hungry corporation with its own private army to rule over millions lie hidden in these back streets. The fine brickwork of the Clive house now forms one side of that little street. Clive completely transformed Britain's role in India. But his former home now lies in ruins, all but forgotten. This filthy, rubbish-strewn passageway is now the way into the house. I don't think it was the main entrance, although there are steps left here. And the place has been taken over by crows and goodness knows what other creatures. And this must have been a spectacularly grand room where there has been some restoration, I think. Look at these wonderful classical pillars. I imagine before they were rendered and maybe made to look like marble. Clive took over a Mughal villa of a single story and he added another one. And here you see the 2 stories. Robert Clive was the delinquent son of a minor Shropshire landowner. When he was 17, his family bought him a job in the East India Company. It had existed for more than a century, But this young firebrand would lead it to become a superpower. I found one of the present-day inhabitants. Beautiful high ceiling here. This could also have been a grand room. And here, I think, the main entrance. Very handsome flight of rounded steps. And the visitor would be confronted with this set of magnificent arches, very imposing. Clive knew how to live. The India that Clive stepped into was ruled by the Mughals. At its height, their mighty empire stretched from modern-day Afghanistan down the length of the subcontinent. They built awe-inspiring forts, mosques, and mausoleums that expressed their immense wealth and power. But in the 18th century, the Mughal Empire was fracturing, and Clive challenged its waning power with the help of the East India Company's private army. With no military training, he deployed the company's troops against the French in India. And when the Mughals occupied Calcutta, he expelled them at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. With actions like that, the company was transformed from a trading venture into a military and imperial power. And Robert Clive became the undisputed ruler of Bengal. The traders of the East India Company had ventured in search of fortunes for themselves and their shareholders in Britain. At that time, India offered a dazzling concentration of riches, representing well over a fifth of the world's wealth. Here's what lured the European powers to India: pepper, spices, silks, cottons, perfumes. The appetite for such fineries was insatiable. For 150 years, the British East India Company competed with others to win or force trading concessions from the wealthy Mughals. Jawahar Sircar is a noted historian and a former secretary of India's Ministry of Culture. How does it happen that a man who's bought his position as a clerk becomes a military leader?
He came in as a clerk and pushed his pen for 2 dull years. Didn't excite him much. But then when the battle started, he showed an extraordinary courage. He had an inbuilt suicidal streak. And that earned him more and more pips on his shoulder, and he rose very fast.
What change do you think Robert Clive brought about in the East India Company?
No one before him or after him was such a buccaneer. Without his bravado, without his excesses, without his stratagem, his cunning, his ruthlessness in getting things done, which are most untrader-like, he turned a miserable group of accountants into swashbuckling pirates. He turned the East India Company into a power to reckon with.
Battlefield success and backroom deals gave Clive the leverage to force an extraordinary concession from the Mughals: the right to collect Bengal's taxes. A company of traders, answerable to no one but its shareholders, now had the power of emperors. And that unleashed an era of rapacious corporate greed.
Clive made a lot of money. He would never have made that in Shropshire. Or, they would not make it anywhere. It was mind-boggling.
For the East India Company, profit was king. As long as the corporation made money, employees were free to line their own pockets too. Clive, now one of Britain's wealthiest men, bought up grand houses back home and stuffed them with priceless Indian treasures. Company men like him also used their plundered riches to acquire political power in Britain, putting MPs on the payroll and buying elections to Parliament. Here in Bengal, the greed went unchecked.
It had disastrous consequences. 1/3 of the population of this province, which was 30 million, 1/3, that's almost 10 million people died. And the Brits are held responsible even till today.
They died how?
Starvation. starvation. He started tampering around with natural lines of supply, storage, taxing, overtaxing, so the peasants fled their farms. It's so very much part of the psyche that we had what is called this great man-made famine.
The East India Company, after Robert Clive, the way he develops it, can you compare it to anything in our modern life?
This company went in for a type of exploitation that the world has not seen. The convergence of profit with state power, with military power, is the prototype of all transnational exploitative companies that you've seen.
The actions of the East India Company caused scandal in Britain, with parliamentarians condemning the rampant greed and corruption. The East India Company's mismanagement in Bengal sent its shares crashing. But as in the recent banking crisis, it was deemed too big to fail. It was bailed out by the government, which acquired influence over how it was run in a sort of public-private partnership. Within a year, Robert Clive was dead in mysterious circumstances. Samuel Johnson said he'd acquired his fortunes by such crimes that his consciousness of them impelled him to cut his own throat. Others have suggested that he overdosed on the highly addictive drug that would become the East India Company's most profitable commodity. Its trade would turn the company, backed by the British state, into history's biggest narcotics dealer. By the 1770s, the traders of the East India Company had laid the foundations of Britain's empire in India. Calcutta was at its heart, and its arteries of international trade reached across the globe. From the west coast of Africa, British ships carried enslaved people to the Caribbean to grow sugar for the British market. From China, East India Company ships brought the tea on which the British were hooked. But to quench Britain's growing thirst, the company needed to sell Chinese people a product they wanted to buy. The answer was a highly addictive drug grown here in Britain's Indian territories. In the opium agency of the East India Company, 2,500 clerks in 100 offices toiled to control the cultivation of the narcotic by Indian farmers, its quality and its transport to warehouses like this. The highly profitable export of a few thousand tons per year kept a swathe of China's population addicted. And when their government objected, Britain fought 2 wars rather than give up the trade. All that was about buying China tea so that the British Empire could enjoy a lovely cuppa. At the end of the 18th century, Britain appointed a Governor-General with a grand imperial plan. Richard Wellesley was a close ally of the Prime Minister William Pitt. He'd been politically ambitious at home and in India was attracted more by power than profit. Under his governorship, the East India Company's private armies marched across India, conquering vast territories and installing puppet princes. With Wellesley at the helm, this great multinational company was creating empire. Richard Wellesley was the elder brother of the man who would become the Duke of Wellington. He was responsible not only for Government House in Calcutta, but also this more personal villa of the Caesars out here at Barrackpore. The British in India ruled over regional royalty and aristocracy, leaders of great wealth who dressed flamboyantly and built palaces of extraordinary ostentation. And Wellesley believed that the imperial power should not be outdone in display. In 1801, Wellesley started building this palatial country retreat for the Governor-General. 15 miles upriver from Calcutta. A magnificent entrance, you might say, but in fact, this is simply the back door to the garden. The principal approach, which would have been experienced by visitors, lies on the other side, where at the moment, major works are underway. Wellesley was imitating Mughal splendor, but he expressed it in an unmistakably British style. The first thing, the scale of it. Superb proportions, wonderful tall ceilings, marbled floor. This is just the rear veranda and into the ballroom. And although from the outside it really could pass as a British stately home, I think not so inside. There are an almost uncountable number of double doors because the point was that air should flow. I should have arrived under the portico, protected from the typhoon, and then I would have come up one of these twin staircases, and then I should have arrived here in the entrance lobby. This is the proper way to enter the house. These days, Barrackpore is home to the Bengali Police Training Academy and is being painstakingly restored by its Director General, Shoman Mitra. Shoman, during Wellesley's tenure, what happened to the British Empire? Was it expanding?
The empire wasn't established during that time. It was part of the East India Company. But he had a vision towards that. He acquired a lot of land. He also fought a lot of wars. And I would say, while doing this, he realized if one has to control India, one has to be like a Raja or a king or a Maharaja. And that's how he built these grand palaces and mansions.
And how do you view that now? Because in a way, he was foreseeing the future of the British Empire. Indeed, he was creating the future of the British Empire.
Yes, this is one of the important markers, establishing big mansions, big houses, government houses, so that people they have come to rule are awestruck.
What did the East India Company think of that?
Oh, they were horrified. They rebuked him. They called him back in 1805 and said that we have sent you for trade. This is not what you should be doing.
You are a free nation. You are a republic. Why do you want to restore colonial history?
I'm not talking about whether colonialism was good or bad or whatever, but certainly it was a part of our shared history. And this particular building was built with the hard work of our craftsmen, Indian craftsmen. True, it might be designed by Britishers, but it's part of our shared global architecture. So how can I deny our past?
When Richard Wellesley left India, there was no mistaking that the British had assumed control. But in the subsequent decades, influential voices at home argued that it wasn't enough for the company to rule India. Their view was that the British had to civilize it too. Despite company resistance, Parliament was convinced to allow Christian missionaries into India. It would lead to tensions, especially amongst the troops on which British rule depended. The East India Company's armies consisted mainly of Indian soldiers known as sepoys. The company behaved insensitively, toppling local rulers arbitrarily and greedily, trampling on local hierarchies and customs, whilst the sepoys feared that Christian missionaries were out to destroy their religions. These issues were emotive, explosively so. Less than a mile from the Governor-General's Barrackpore retreat, one sepoy was pushed to the point of insurrection. The British introduced the Enfield rifle. To load it, the sepoy was required to bite off the end of the cartridge, which might have been greased with either pig or cow fat. One was repugnant to Muslims and the other to Hindus. On the 29th of March, 1857, a devout upper caste Hindu sepoy called Mangal Pandey, in disgust, urged his fellow soldiers to rise up in revolt, and he himself attacked two officers. Legend has it that he was hanged by the British from a banyan tree. It was an incident at the start of the year of the Indian Rebellion, an event which would prove extremely bloodthirsty and of great political significance. Rebellion in the army swiftly spread to the civilians of north and central India. For the British, the uprising of an indigenous population who greatly outnumbered them was the stuff of nightmares. Murderous attacks on Europeans were met with brutal reprisals. To understand why company rule broke down in such a shockingly violent way, I'm meeting historian Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee. What do you think were Mangal Pandit's reasons for going on his rampage?
There was the persistent and very deep fear among the sepoys that there was a full-blown conspiracy on the part of the British government to spoil the caste and the religion of the sepoys. The British government was seen to be interfering with the way people lived their lives and the way society had been held together, had been made to function for generations and centuries.
This list of insensitivities, who's to blame for this? Who is insensitive? The British government, the East India Company, the individual? Where does it come from?
These are administrators who are coming out to India and they find a society that is completely alien to them. And they think that this is an inferior civilization because they don't match up to our European standards. Therefore, it is our duty to change and civilize this people of India.
So does that mean that these people with attitudes that we now regard as appalling,
Yes.
so condescending, so contemptuous, does it mean that nonetheless they could themselves have been conscientious and well-meaning?
Yes, but they were totally insensitive to what impact their policies would have on the people who were being affected by those policies. There's a mismatch there, a complete divorce between intention and consequence.
The number of people killed during the rebellion and its aftermath is almost unimaginable. 800,000 people died, the great majority of them Indians. When the news reached Britain, there was outrage at the scale of the violence. Out of this horror, a reformed empire would emerge, personified by an empress who claimed to rule India's teeming millions with the affection of a mother. The shocking violence of the Indian Rebellion shook British rule in India to its core. After a year of bloodshed, control was restored, but the British government could no longer allow the company to rule. The government removed the East India Company from control. Its corruption had long been an embarrassment, and formalized rule by the Crown. Queen Victoria would become the Empress of India, commencing the high point of the British Raj. Queen Victoria would be portrayed as mother to her subjects in India. The company's monumental buildings were repurposed and sumptuous new ones were built, creating a capital city worthy of India's status as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. This magnificent dome, borne aloft by 28 Corinthian columns, is the old post office and a metaphor for British colonial rule. Staffed mainly by Indians, the postal service spread out across the country, bringing letter deliveries to all. After the rebellion, just 20,000 British officials and soldiers were required to run Indian civil servants and troops who administered a subcontinent of 300 million. To understand how the empire now claimed legitimacy and distanced itself from the East India Company, I'm speaking to Anthony Kachachurian, a Kolkata historian and writer. So after 1857, what would you say about the British rebooting of its empire here in India?
They had to truly start governing. It couldn't just be hoarding chests full of diamonds from the mines of Hyderabad. Queen Victoria's proclamation says We are here to provide you with equal governance and fair play and trade for everybody. Everybody will be treated equally. We will not impose religion on you. But the giveaway is right at the end. There are 2 or 3 words along the lines of, but don't forget, we are here to rule you because you are our subjects.
How do you think it's possible that only about 20,000 British officials and soldiers are able to administer India?
All of India, going across from what we now call Pakistan right the way across to Bangladesh, was chopped up into 250 odd districts. And they broke it down. So every district had an Indian civil services officer and a police superintendent. And these were the 2 left and right hands of the empire. They were the be-all and end-all for those districts.
It strikes me that the British took their imperial duties seriously in the sense that, for example, the second sons of important families in Britain would come out here for decades, they'd bring up their families here, and they would, in a way, be committed to India.
They had a supreme belief that they were sent out here by the Queen herself and God above her. They had a divine right to rule. It was as simple as that.
Towards the end of Queen Victoria's reign, a man took charge determined to exhibit the splendours of the Raj. George Nathaniel Curzon came from an old aristocratic family, and in India he would perfect the empire's display in the most grandiose way. This footage from 1911 shows the scale of the Delhi Durbars, a spectacular imperial pageant pioneered by him in 1903.
It's a huge, huge statement. Curzon is trying to put across that the age of rapacity, of loot, have now ended. Now it is about the King Emperor ruling India. It's about governance. This is the grand statement that all of you kings and maharajas from across the country come down here on bended knee and accept the right of the King Emperor to rule across the country in harmony.
Curzon would also give an old company institution a new lease of life. At Barrackpore, the viceroys and their families could take their leisure in an exclusive British enclave. Calcutta was then the capital of British India. That meant an immense area, including even present-day Burma. And so from here was ruled an enormous number of human beings. And to this place came people from all over the empire. So would I be right in thinking this is the ballroom?
Yes, it is. It is a ballroom with, as you can see, a sprung floor.
Historian Manabi Mitra has researched the rarefied world of Barrackpore when it was home to the empire's leaders at play.
It was probably one of the most celebrated ballrooms of British India because everybody who was somebody and was close enough to merit the Viceroy's attention came here. We have people like Randolph Churchill, Winston Churchill, George V, as well as royalty and nobility from all across Europe.
And here's a rather surprising item. A fireplace. Would you need such a thing here?
Barrackpore was an approximation of home. It was a grafting of a piece of Little England on an Indian territory. So I suppose the fireplace was used as a reminder that here was a little slice of England.
These photographs capture the British in India when they were off duty. They show a world of characteristically British pursuits, the lifestyle of Britain's upper classes transplanted to Asia. But how did the Raj's rulers relate to the India all around them?
So what we have here is a typical round of tiffin, which would have the usual fish dish and the meat dish, but done in a little different way. This is roast lamb, as you can see. Should I serve you some?
Oh, thank you very much. Oh, and this looks delicious. What is this?
Yes, this is mulligatawny soup. It's soup made with lentils and chicken broth.
Delightful.
You're right.
Today I'm being served a tiffin lunch, the kind of food that would have been enjoyed by the Raj's top brass and their guests. I'm going to try the mulligatawny. In their social life, did the British ever invite Indians here?
The thing about Government House Barrackpore was that it was a kind of a sacred, inviolable zone where only friends would be invited.
But waited upon hand and foot by Indians,
Oh, yes.
I assume.
Yes. In all the photographs that we have seen of dining under the banyan tree, we see an army of Babachis and Khidmat cars and servers standing behind in full regalia, but always to wait upon the sahibs.
What about the Indians, as it were, on the outside, who probably couldn't even see in? What did they feel about this way of life?
In this park, there are two portions. One is the private portion and the public portion. And in the public portion, people were allowed in. So they were allowed to have a glimpse of the park.
They could come and gape at the imperial markers and they could look at them approvingly.
The British in India were always a tiny minority. The imperial institutions that they created allowed them to rule over a vast population. But a challenge to British supremacy was brewing within one of the institutions that had made the Raj a success. Trams started running in Calcutta in 1901. The British famously covered India in railway tracks, built for their own purposes, of course, but nonetheless a useful legacy of infrastructure. The colonists also decided that they needed a broad class of Indian educated to be the administrators of the empire. But of course, such educated civil servants would form the nucleus of those looking for self-government and later demanding independence. Then, in 1905, Curzon made a controversial decision with long-lasting consequences for the empire in India. Bengal was India's largest province, with a population of 85 million people. Curzon decided it would be easier for the British to rule if it was split into two. He partitioned it along religious lines, with the western province being majority Hindu and the eastern being majority Muslim. The British decision to partition Bengal was met with massive anger. From these riverbanks, the writer Rabindranath Tagore led a great procession declaring a day of national mourning. India was set on the path of peaceful but wounding protest.
This song played the key role in the partition of Bengal around 1905. The Nobel laureate Tagore, he composed this song because this song was written as a poem in the mid-19th century.
Musicians Surendra Malik and Sumyajit Das come from old Kolkata families.
Vande Mataram, Vande Mataram, Phulla kusumita drumadal shobhini, Suhasini.
What he was saying was that you can't have your mother split into two. The country should not be split into two. It was a song which brought Hindus, Muslims, everyone together on the streets and gave them the power to fight.
Thank you so much. What a beautiful voice you have and how well you play. How did you both feel performing that?
It has a lot of bloodshed involved in it, passion of people to get their motherland for them. So it's not just a song for us. It gives a big goosebump whenever we perform this.
What was Tagore's view of the British Raj?
I think from 1905 and the partition of Bengal, because he quite understood the political game that was happening of not only splitting the land of India, but splitting the major religion of India. You know, the Muslims that way and the Hindus this way, and in a way, dividing them to rule them.
British people would probably think, the struggle for Indian independence, Gandhi. But all of the things we've been talking about, or most of them, are while Gandhi is still in South Africa. So for you, is Tagore as big a figure, maybe a bigger figure in the movement as Gandhi?
Yes. The partition had hurt Bangladesh and India, the two parts of Bengal. So these were the places which created the platform for the Nehrus, Gandhis, and the faces of the movement to stand where they are today.
The British reversed their decision and reunited Bengal in 1911. But their insensitivity had launched India's independence movement. When the empire was drawn into the Great War, Indians offered their support but demanded new freedoms. For centuries, Mughal India was one of the world's great powers. It controlled a fifth of the world's wealth. But that changed when the British came. I've entered a factory that sounds like the 19th century and looks like a Renaissance painting. These beautiful shafts of light which are illuminating the dust which is everywhere in the air. In 19th century India, factories like this were rare. At that time, Britain was the workshop of the world. And India's once thriving economy had been reduced to a supplier of raw materials for British factories. For Robert Clive, cotton was one of the great riches of India. But then jute, a versatile and cheap crop which had been used for millennia, was found to have new uses for rope, for sacking, and as a backing for linoleum. During the First World War, Britain needed India to ramp up its manufacturing output. Bengali jute production went into overdrive for sandbags and tarpaulins in the trenches. And 1.4 million Indians answered Britain's call to arms. India's tremendous sacrifice for empire emboldened it to make demands. When Britain went to war in 1914, it summoned forces from across the empire, hugely boosting the numbers that could be deployed. Indians fought tenaciously for empire, but also with future freedom in mind. For why should not India gain, as its reward, the same self-government by then enjoyed by Australia and Canada? In the Great War, Britain promised India self-government. But in its aftermath, those promises were broken. Then a terrible massacre occurred in Amritsar. In this place, called the Jallianwala Bagh, British troops opened fire on unarmed civilians gathered in peaceful protest. The slaughter was a turning point for many Indians, convincing them that they must break free. Well, how did Indians feel when in 1939, yet again, the British Empire asked them to go and fight?
In 1939, the situation was much more complex.
Kashik Roy is a professor of military history.
The political class, they are more clever, that it should not be 1919 again. Then that's why the Congress said that Britain must declare a date for independence. Otherwise, Congress would not give support.
What is the view towards the First World War of Mohandas Gandhi, and what is his view towards the Second World War?
Between First World War and Second World War, Gandhi's view completely, transformed. He said, don't believe the British. The British will again go back to their promises as they have done after First World War. Nobody could really trust Britain.
In World War II, Britain once again mobilized the empire, despite resistance from Indian leaders. Indian troops would play a crucial role in the Allies' victory. But even as Indian soldiers fought in theaters of war across the globe, here in Bengal, a catastrophic famine brought death to millions. How important is the Bengal Famine of 1943 in the story of India?
It is our Holocaust. I mean, everybody knows about the Jewish Holocaust, but very few in the world knows about the Bengal Holocaust, engineered by the British. So much so,
That's your view, that it was engineered by the British?
Yeah. It was structural because whatever food was there in Bengal, it had to be sucked out to feed the army. Remember, imperialism mostly depended not merely on brute force, but also on confidence, moral legitimacy. So that completely washed away.
With the broken promise to India over Home Rule and the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh, and later with the famine during the wartime in Bengal, British trustworthiness, legitimacy and prestige bled away, and Indian non-violence became unstoppably victorious. Britain partitioned India from Pakistan and gave them both independence in 1947. In the 7 decades since, India has rediscovered its power and has become a global economic force once more. But how does it deal with its history of subjugation? When you look back at the British in Indian history, the fact that Indians were not allowed at the top table, the massacre at Amritsar, the famine in Bengal, are these still things that really rankle?
They do rankle in some minds, especially in people who were directly affected by these things.
Jayanta Sengupta is curator of the Victoria Memorial Hall, the most visited monument in Kolkata and the most visible relic of its British past.
But by and large, I think we have come to terms with that. And the British rule, notwithstanding how exploitative and how brutal the empire was, is part of our being, is part of our soul. And we carry it with acceptance and tolerance.
How do the British, in their long time in India, change India?
If you look at the economic impact of how the British ruled India, the industries, the artisanal industries declined. It was reduced to a raw material producing country geared to the British colonial interests.
Those who want to put the best gloss on British rule talk about good administration, railways, justice, education, a single language. What do you make of those things?
These things were created in order to serve the interests of the empire. But if it was not a part of good governance in the colonial period, it has given us a legacy which we have shaped to our best interests over the long run. The Indians took it on and then made it into an expression of India's democracy.
Britain came to India to exploit it. The East India Company looted its wealth and toppled its rulers. The Indian lived as a second-class citizen in his own country. But British colonial rule brought together 2,000 ethnic groups in a single country and gave it a unifying language and infrastructure and government and systems of law and education. The India of today, the world's largest democracy, one of its largest economies, is inevitably the product of the relationship between India and Britain. A number of India's industries have boomed and become multinationals, heavily invested in the British economy. Today, as India's wealth grows, it's easier to understand that this subcontinent was once a repository of riches. In the next program, I discover how Britain's empire was built by pirates.
They were given permission from the King of England to plunder, and plunder they did.
How millions were ripped from their homelands and stripped of their identities.
I cannot say exactly where I'm from. I just can't trace that back.